Welcome to North Stories. I remember those days like they were yesterday. The streets of East Falls, Philadelphia, felt cold, no matter the season. The people walked fast, heads down, faces weathered by time and hard work. My name's Vinny Rosso. You probably know me now, but back then? I was just another guy from the neighborhood trying to make it. My days were simple. I'd wake up before dawn, lace up my worn-out sneakers, and head to Tony's boxing gym. The place wasn't much, faded posters on the walls, the smell of sweat and stale smoke hanging thick in the air, and the constant clang of the heavy bags. But it was home to me. Tony, the old man who ran the joint, had been around since forever. He trained a couple of champs back in the day, but now he mostly worked with guys like me, small-time fighters with big dreams. He had this raspy voice, like he'd smoked 1,000 packs in his lifetime, and every time he yelled, "Keep your hands up, Vinny!" it cut through the noise of the gym. I spent hours in that place, sparring with other guys, shadowboxing, running laps around the neighborhood. See, boxing was all I had. I didn't have much of a family. My old man had been in and out of my life, more interested in a bottle than his son. And my mom, well, she did what she could, but I knew the weight of her disappointment. "Vinny, you gotta get a real job," she'd say, her voice soft but full of worry. I always brushed her off. "I got this, Ma," I'd tell her. But deep down, I knew I was hanging by a thread. I wasn't anything special. I'd win a fight here, lose one there, but I had heart. And sometimes, that was enough to keep you going. But life didn't cut you any breaks. You either fought through it or got swallowed whole. And let me tell you, Philly could swallow you whole in the blink of an eye. One night, after another exhausting day at the gym, I was walking home when I ran into Louis, Snake, Montez. Snake was an old friend. Well, more like a guy who knew everyone and everything going on in the underground world. He leaned against the street lamp, the flickering light casting long shadows across his face. "Vinny, you heard the news?" he said, his voice slick, like the streets themselves. "What news?" I asked, half interested. "Frank the Hurricane Stevens. He's looking for an opponent. Televised fight. Big money. You'd be crazy not to try." I stopped dead in my tracks. Frank Stevens was the reigning heavyweight champ, a beast of a man. He had taken down some of the biggest names in the sport. And here was Snake, telling me he needed an opponent. It didn't make sense. Why would a guy like Stevens need to fight some nobody like me? "Why me?" I asked, skeptical. "Why not?" Snake grinned. "Stevens wants a story. He wants to prove he can take down any fighter, from the champs to the scrappy underdogs. You fit the bill, Rosso." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "No way. I ain't got a shot against a guy like that." Snake chuckled, lighting a cigarette. "Maybe. But maybe it ain't about winning, Vinny. It's about showing up. You get in that ring with Stevens, win or lose, people are gonna know your name." It sounded insane. But something inside me stirred, a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in years. I knew I wasn't ready for a fight like that. But what if this was my one shot? I went to Tony the next day, told him everything Snake had said. Tony shook his head, his grizzled face twisting in frustration. "You ain't ready for a guy like Stevens, Vinny. He'll eat you alive." "I know," I said. "But what if I train harder? What if this is it? My chance to make something of myself?" Tony sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't just train harder, kid. You gotta change the way you think. This ain't just a fight, it's survival. If you get in that ring with Stevens, you're gonna have to dig deep. Deeper than you ever have." I didn't back down. I told Tony I was all in. He looked at me for a long time, then finally nodded. "All right, Vinny. But you're gonna have to give me everything you got. No more slacking. No more distractions. You got 6 weeks to get ready for the fight of your life." And just like that, everything changed. The next day, Tony put me on a new training regimen. We'd start at dawn, running through the streets of Philly, my feet pounding against the cracked pavement, the cold air burning in my lungs. Then it was hours in the gym. Sparring, bag work, drills, over and over until my body felt like it was falling apart. Some days I thought about quitting. The pain was unbearable. My muscles screamed, my knuckles were raw, and every bone in my body ached. But every time I felt like giving up, I thought about my old man, sitting in some dive bar, wasting his life away. I thought about my mom, working 2 jobs just to make ends meet. And I thought about what it would feel like to be somebody. There were nights I couldn't sleep, the anxiety twisting in my gut like a knife. I knew the odds were stacked against me. Frank Stevens was a monster. He'd knocked out his last 3 opponents in the first round. Everyone said I was crazy for taking the fight. But there was something in me, a stubbornness, maybe, that wouldn't let me walk away. One night, about 2 weeks before the fight, I got a call from Snake. "Vinny, you better be ready," he said, his voice low. "Stevens ain't talking you lightly. Word on the street is he's training harder than ever. He's looking to make an example out of you." I hung up the phone, the weight of those words pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. Was I making a mistake? Was I about to walk into a slaughterhouse? But then I remembered what Tony had said. This wasn't just a fight. It was survival. I wasn't just fighting Frank Stevens. I was fighting for my life, for my future, for a shot at redemption. As the days crept closer to the fight, the buzz around the neighborhood started to grow. People would stop me in the street, wishing me luck, telling me they'd be watching. It was strange, hearing my name on people's lips, like I was already someone important. And then there was Maria. She'd been my rock through it all. We'd grown up together, and she knew me better than anyone. I hadn't told her about the fight at first. I didn't want her to worry, but when she found out, she wasn't happy. "Vinny, this is crazy. You're gonna get yourself killed," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "I know it's risky," I told her, taking her hand. "But I gotta do this. I need to know what I'm made of." Maria sighed, shaking her head. "You're already enough, Vinny. You don't need to prove anything to anyone." But I didn't believe her. Not yet. The night of the fight came quicker than I expected. The arena was packed, the air buzzing with excitement. I stood in the locker room, my heart pounding in my chest, my fists wrapped tight. Tony stood next to me, his face hard, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, pride maybe. "You ready for this, kid?" he asked. I nodded, though my stomach was in knots. "Remember what I taught you. Keep your head down, move fast, and don't let him rattle you. You can do this." I didn't know if he really believed that, but I needed to. When I walked out into the ring, the lights were blinding. The roar of the crowd hit me like a wave. And there he was, Frank Stevens, standing across from me, a mountain of muscle and confidence. He looked at me like I was already beaten. The bell rang. And in that moment, everything faded away. There was no crowd, no fear, no doubt, just me and him. I threw the first punch, and the fight was on. The moment that bell rang, everything else disappeared. The crowd's deafening roar fell into the background, a distant hum beneath the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Frank, the Hurricane, Stevens was no joke. He stood across from me, towering, his fists raised like sledgehammers. The guy moved like a freight train, but I wasn't going to let him steamroll me, not without a fight. I threw the first punch, a jab aimed at his jaw, testing the waters. He blocked it effortlessly, his expression unchanged. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and calculating. He knew he had me outclassed in every way. My legs felt like lead, but I circled him, staying light on my feet, remembering Tony's words, "Keep moving, Vinny. Don't stand still. Make him chase you." I danced around him, throwing quick jabs, nothing too committed. It was about survival right now, not winning. Not yet. Stevens didn't chase me, though. He stood there, waiting, patient. He didn't need to rush. When he finally moved, it was like the ground itself shook. He closed the distance between us with a single step, and then I felt it, his first punch. It wasn't even a full hook, more like a half swing, but it landed square on my ribs, and the air rushed out of my lungs. Pain shot through my body, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, trying to regain my footing. He didn't follow up right away. He just watched me, like a predator sizing up its prey. He was toying with me. I could hear Tony from the corner, his voice sharp like a drill sergeant. "Move! Get out of there, Vinny! Keep your guard up!" But my body wasn't responding the way it should have. My arms felt heavy, and the pain in my ribs made every breath feel like a stabbed wound. But I had to push through. I had no choice. I went in for another jab, this time aiming low, trying to throw him off balance. He barely flinched. His counterpunch came so fast I barely saw it. His right hand connected with my face, and the world exploded into a burst of white light. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I was going down. My knees buckled, but somehow, I stayed upright. The crowd roared, but it felt distant again, like a dream I couldn't fully wake up from. Stevens grinned, knowing he had me on the ropes. This was his game. He'd play with me, drag it out, make a spectacle. The commentators were probably already writing me off. The underdog story people had hoped for? It was slipping away with every punch I took. I staggered back, trying to catch my breath, but Stevens wasn't letting up. He came at me again, throwing a barrage of punches. I blocked what I could, but he was relentless. A hook to the body, a jab to the head, another to the gut. I was getting pummeled, and it felt like the fight could end any second. But there was something in me that wouldn't quit. I couldn't quit. Every time I felt like going down, I saw my mom's face, working herself to the bone, worried about me. I saw Maria, her voice in my head, telling me I didn't have to do this, that I was already enough. I thought of all those nights in the gym, when I pushed through exhaustion, when I fought for every inch. I couldn't just roll over. Not now. Not ever. I don't know where it came from, maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just blind desperation, but I threw a punch that connected. A clean hit, right across Stevens' cheek. His head snapped back slightly, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. It wasn't a hard enough hit to knock him off balance, but it was something. And that's all I needed. That tiny spark. The second round came, and I was still standing, though barely. My body was battered, and I could feel the blood trickling down the side of my face from a cut near my eyebrow. But I wasn't out. Not yet. Tony shoved the mouthpiece back in my mouth as I sat in the corner between rounds, gasping for breath. "You gotta dig deep, Vinny," Tony growled, his face inches from mine. "You're still in this, but you gotta start hitting him where it hurts. Don't go toe-to-toe with him. You ain't winning that way. Hit and move. Hit and move." I nodded, even though my body felt like it was falling apart. The bell rang again, and the third round began. Stevens came out with more aggression this time. He wanted to end it. His punches were heavier, faster, but I stuck to Tony's advice. I dodged, slipped under his massive swings, and jabbed when I could. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't winning me points with the judges, but it was keeping me alive. The crowd wasn't sure what to make of it. Some were booing, others were shouting for me to just give up. But I could feel something changing. Stevens was getting frustrated. He wasn't landing the clean shots he wanted, and I could tell it was pissing him off. And then, in the fourth round, it happened. I don't know if it was luck or if all those hours in the gym had finally paid off, but I saw an opening. Stevens overextended on a right hook, and I slipped under it, driving an uppercut straight into his gut. It wasn't a knockout punch, but it was enough to make him stagger, just for a second. The crowd gasped, and I felt a surge of energy run through me. For the first time, Stevens didn't look invincible. I pressed forward, throwing another punch, this time connecting with his jaw. He stumbled back, and I kept pushing. Adrenaline had taken over, numbing the pain in my body. I landed a few more shots, and Stevens actually had to cover up. For a split second, I felt like I could win. But then Stevens roared back, like an angry bull. He came at me with a flurry of punches, wild and furious. I dodged some, but not all. One of them caught me square in the chest, and I felt the wind rush out of me again. I went down hard, my back hitting the canvas with a thud that echoed in my skull. The ref started the count, and for a moment, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. 1, 2. Everything was blurry. I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt like they weighed a ton. My legs weren't responding. I could see Tony in the corner, shouting at me, his voice barely breaking through the fog in my head. 3. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to remember why I was doing this. The pain was overwhelming, but there was something stronger than that pain, the fear of losing. Not the fight, but everything I'd worked for. Everything I was fighting for. 4. I forced my hands to grip the ropes, pulling myself to my knees. The crowd was chanting now, a mixture of boos and cheers, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was getting back on my feet. 5. I was up on one knee now, my vision still blurry, but the fog was lifting. Stevens was standing there, waiting for me to get back up. He didn't think I would. Hell, I wasn't even sure if I would. 6. But I stood up. Somehow, I got to my feet, and the ref checked me over, asking if I could continue. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I even believed it. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The bell rang again, and I stumbled back to my corner, barely holding on. Tony grabbed me by the shoulders, shaking me. "You gotta dig deeper, Vinny. You can still do this. Don't let him break you." I wasn't sure if I could. My body was screaming at me to stop, to quit, to stay down. But in my heart, something told me that I had more left. More than I thought. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. This was about survival. About standing up one more time than I got knocked down. I was still in this fight, and I wasn't going to go down without swinging. The 5th round was about to start, and I knew that this was my moment, the turning point where I'd either give it everything I had, or let the pain and doubt take over. This wasn't just a fight. This was my life. The 5th round started, and the air in the arena felt thick with tension. My legs were like jelly, barely holding me up, but I refused to show it. Stevens, on the other hand, looked like he was just getting warmed up. His eyes locked onto mine, the hunger to end this fight burning behind them. He wanted to break me, but I wasn't going to let him have the satisfaction. The bell rang, and the sound was like a gunshot, setting us both in motion. Stevens charged at me again, throwing heavy punches. He knew I was weak, knew that my defenses were crumbling, but I kept moving. My body had been pushed past its limits, but there was something inside me, something stronger than the pain, that kept me going. I dodged his blows as best I could, slipping under his hooks, barely avoiding his jabs, but my head was spinning. Every time I moved, it felt like the ground was tilting beneath me. I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. Stevens was relentless, like a machine, each punch coming with brutal precision. But I wasn't just trying to survive anymore. I was looking for that one opening, that split second where I could make him pay. Tony's voice echoed in my head, "Don't go toe-to-toe. Hit and move. Hit and move." But there was no moving when Stevens finally caught me with a right hook. It was a solid punch, one that rattled my brain. I felt my knees buckle, my vision going dark for a split second. The canvas rushed up to meet me, but I caught myself just in time, using the ropes to stay on my feet. The crowd gasped, and the ref stepped in for a second, but I waved him off, telling him I was still good. Barely. Stevens grinned, thinking he had me. He came in for the kill, his fists ready to deliver the final blow, but something in me snapped. Maybe it was the fear of losing, or maybe it was pure instinct, but I swung with everything I had. It wasn't a perfect punch, hell, it wasn't even a good one, but it connected. My fist slammed into Stevens' ribs, and for the first time, I saw him wince. He took a step back, and I saw it, that moment of hesitation. That was all I needed. I threw another punch, this time hitting him square in the side of the head. He didn't go down, but I could see it in his eyes, the doubt. For the first time, Stevens didn't look invincible. He looked human. The crowd, once almost certain of my defeat, started to shift. People were on their feet, shouting my name. They saw it too. I wasn't supposed to be in this fight, but here I was, still standing, still punching. The energy in the arena flipped, and I could feel it feeding into me. Every time Stevens landed a blow, I shook it off, and when I hit him, it felt like the tide was turning, even if just for a second. Stevens came at me again, but this time I was ready. I blocked his punches, weaving in and out of his reach. My body was screaming, every nerve on fire, but I had one thing going for me now: momentum. I wasn't backing down. Not now. I slipped under his left hook and countered with a hard right to his midsection. His breath came out in a sharp hiss, and I saw the frustration in his eyes. That's when I realized something. Frank Stevens, the reigning heavyweight champ, was scared. Not of me, but of losing. He'd spent his whole career on top, never doubting his place in the world. But now, in this ring, he was facing a guy who wasn't supposed to last more than a couple rounds, and I was still here, still fighting, refusing to stay down. That fear gave me hope. It gave me strength. The bell rang, signaling the end of the round, and I staggered back to my corner, barely able to stand. My body was on the verge of collapsing, but the crowd's energy kept me upright. Tony grabbed me, his face inches from mine. "Vinny, you got him. You hear me? You got him. He's breaking. He ain't used to this." Tony's words came out fast, desperate. I could see the fire in his eyes. He believed. For the first time in this whole fight, Tony wasn't just trying to keep me alive. He was pushing me to win. I took deep breaths, trying to clear my head, trying to ignore the searing pain in my ribs, the throbbing in my head. The blood from the cut over my eye dripped down the side of my face, but I didn't care. The next round was everything. Maria's face flashed in my mind. She was somewhere in the crowd, watching, praying, no doubt. I'd seen her before the fight, her eyes full of fear, begging me not to do this. But I had to. I had to show her, and everyone else, that I wasn't just some kid from the neighborhood destined for nothing. I had to prove it to myself. The bell rang for the 6th round, and I pushed myself off the stool, feeling every bruise, every broken part of my body scream in protest. Stevens came at me hard, trying to end this quickly. His punches were wild now, full of anger and frustration. He was making mistakes, and I could see it. I dodged his shots, slipping inside his guard, and landed another punch to his ribs. He grunted, his face contorting in pain, but he didn't go down. The fight became a war of endurance. Stevens had the strength, but I had the heart. I kept moving, kept jabbing, landing shots whenever I could. Every punch I threw felt like it was breaking me a little more, but I wasn't stopping. Not now. Not when I was so close. Stevens came in with another brutal combination, 2 hooks, followed by a jab to my face. I blocked the first 2, but the jab landed clean, snapping my head back. I felt blood pour from my nose, but I didn't care. I threw a right hook, catching him on the chin, and then a left uppercut that sent him stumbling back. The crowd erupted. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, I could do it. I could knock him out. I could win. The adrenaline was coursing through me, and I pressed forward, throwing another series of punches. Stevens blocked most of them, but I could see he was getting tired. His movements were slower, his reactions dulled. This wasn't the invincible champ anymore. This was a man just trying to survive. But then he hit me with a shot I didn't see coming. A left hook straight to my temple. My vision went black for a second, and I felt myself hit the canvas before I even realized what had happened. I was down, flat on my back, staring up at the lights. The crowd was screaming, the ref was counting, and all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. 1, 2. I blinked, trying to clear my head, but everything was spinning. I couldn't move. My body was done. Every muscle, every bone, screamed at me to stay down, to let it end. 3. I saw Tony in the corner, his fists clenched, shouting at me to get up, but his voice felt distant, like it was coming from underwater. 4. I thought about my mom. I thought about Maria. I thought about the years I'd spent in that dingy gym, the hours I'd put into this dream. I couldn't let it end like this. Not now. 5. My hand reached for the ropes, shaking as I tried to pull myself up. My legs felt like they were made of concrete, but I refused to let them stay still. 6. I forced myself to one knee, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ref's voice cut through the noise, telling me to stay down, that it was over, but I wasn't listening. I wasn't done. 7. I pushed myself to my feet, swaying, but standing. The crowd roared, louder than they had all night. I raised my fists, signaling I was still in this, still fighting. The ref checked me over, asking if I could continue. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I even believed it myself. Stevens was waiting, his chest heaving with exhaustion, sweat pouring down his face. He looked at me like I was some kind of ghost, something he couldn't shake. He couldn't believe I was still standing. The fight wasn't over yet. The 7th round was about to start, and I knew that this was it. The moment that would define everything. I was broken, battered, barely able to stand, but there was something inside me that refused to quit. Stevens might have been the champ, but I had something he didn't. I had heart. The 7th round began, and I knew I was stepping into the deep end. Every step I took felt like walking through quicksand. My legs were shot, my ribs screamed with every breath, and my vision was still hazy from that last hit. But none of that mattered. The fight had turned into something else now, something primal. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about not breaking, about proving that I could stand, even when everything was pushing me down. Stevens came at me hard, trying to put me away for good. His punches were wild, full of rage and frustration. I could tell he was desperate to end this. He wasn't used to being pushed like this, and I was making him uncomfortable. I dodged what I could, slipping under his heavy swings, but a few got through. A jab connected with my jaw, snapping my head back. I tasted blood, but I didn't care. I fired back, throwing a quick 1-2 combo that caught him on the chin. It wasn't enough to knock him down, but it was enough to make him think twice. Stevens grunted and charged in again, but his punches were slower now. His stamina was wearing thin, and I could see it in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for a war of endurance. He thought he could walk in, knock me out, and walk out with his title untouched. But now, he was in the trenches with me, and I could see the fear creeping in. He wasn't invincible. He was human. I kept moving, kept throwing jabs, even though my body was begging me to stop. My knuckles were bruised, my muscles on fire, but I wasn't done. Every punch I landed felt like a small victory, a reminder that I was still in control, even if just for a moment. Stevens tried to corner me, driving me into the ropes, but I slipped out, landing a quick shot to his side as I circled away. His frustration was palpable now. He was breathing heavily, his arms dropping lower with each passing second. And then, in the middle of the round, something unexpected happened. Stevens stumbled. It was slight, just a misstep, but I saw it. The crowd saw it too. There was a ripple of shock in the arena. The champ was starting to falter. I pressed forward, throwing more punches, testing his defenses. He blocked most of them, but one punch broke through, a right hook that connected with his jaw. Stevens staggered back, his feet shuffling as he tried to regain his balance. I saw my chance. I went in for another punch, this time aiming for his ribs. It landed with a thud, and Stevens let out a grunt, doubling over slightly. The crowd was on their feet now, the noise in the arena deafening. People were screaming my name, chanting, willing me to keep going. For the first time, it felt like the tide had turned. Stevens, the unbeatable, unstoppable force, was struggling. And I was still standing. But I couldn't let myself get carried away. One wrong move, one misstep, and Stevens could still put me down for good. I had to be smart. I had to play it right. I circled him, keeping my distance, waiting for another opening. Stevens was breathing heavily, his face twisted in anger. He came at me again, swinging wildly, but I dodged, slipping under his punches. He was getting sloppy, desperate to land a knockout blow. Then, out of nowhere, he caught me with a left hook. It wasn't as hard as his earlier punches, but it was enough to rattle me. My legs buckled, and I stumbled back, my vision blurring for a moment. I could hear Tony screaming from the corner, but his voice was drowned out by the ringing in my ears. I was on the ropes again, literally and figuratively. Stevens saw his chance and pressed forward, his fists flying at me with renewed fury. I ducked, dodged, did everything I could to stay on my feet. But Stevens was relentless. He pinned me against the ropes, throwing punch after punch. My arms were up, blocking most of the blows, but a few got through. One hit me square in the ribs, and I felt something crack. Pain exploded through my body, but I clenched my teeth, refusing to go down. I couldn't go down. The ref stepped in, pulling Stevens back, giving me a brief moment to catch my breath. My body was screaming at me to stop, to let it end, but my heart wouldn't let me. I had come too far. I had fought too hard. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. I pushed off the ropes, meeting Stevens in the center of the ring again. His eyes were filled with rage now. He wanted to finish this, to put me away for good. But I could see the cracks. He was tired. He was hurt. And he was doubting himself. We exchanged blows, both of us too exhausted to throw with the same power we had at the start. Each punch felt like it was coming from the bottom of a well, slow and heavy. But I kept going, kept throwing jabs, hooks, anything to keep him off balance. The crowd was a blur of noise and lights, but I could feel their energy, pushing me forward. Then, as if by instinct, I saw it. An opening. Stevens had dropped his guard for just a split second, and I reacted without thinking. I threw a right hook with everything I had left, and it connected. The sound of my fist hitting his jaw was like a gunshot. His head snapped back, his eyes wide with shock. He stumbled, his feet unsteady beneath him, and for a moment, I thought he might go down. But Stevens was a champion for a reason. He recovered, his body swaying but not falling. I went in for another punch, trying to press my advantage, but he blocked it, his arms coming up just in time. The round was nearing its end, and both of us were running on fumes. The bell rang, and we staggered back to our corners, barely able to stand. My body was broken, my chest heaving with every breath, but I was still in it. I glanced over at Stevens, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. Real doubt. Tony rushed to my side, wiping the blood from my face, his voice a low growl in my ear. "You're doing it, Vinny. You're breaking him. One more round. You give it everything you got, you hear me? Don't hold back. He's hanging on by a thread." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how much I had left to give. My body was on the verge of collapse, but my heart kept beating, kept pushing me forward. This was the moment I had been fighting for. The moment where everything would be decided. As the final round approached, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The pain, the exhaustion, it all faded into the background. All that mattered now was the fight. The bell rang, and the final round began. Stevens came at me with everything he had left, but his punches were slower now, less precise. I dodged, slipped under his swings, and fired back with quick jabs. My body was moving on autopilot, driven by pure instinct. I couldn't think, couldn't feel. I was just fighting. We traded punches, both of us too tired to do much more than survive. Stevens hit me with a hard right to the ribs, and I felt another wave of pain shoot through my body, but I didn't stop. I kept throwing punches, kept moving, refusing to give him an inch. And then, in the middle of the round, I saw it. Another opening. Stevens' guard was down, his hands too slow to block. I threw a right hook, then a left uppercut, and both punches connected. Stevens' head snapped back, his body swaying. The crowd roared, their cheers deafening. For a second, I thought he was going down. His legs buckled, his arms flailing as he tried to stay upright. But he didn't fall. I couldn't stop now. I pressed forward, throwing everything I had left at him. Punch after punch, each one landing with a satisfying thud. Stevens was backing up now, his eyes wide with panic. And then it happened. I don't know if it was the punch or the exhaustion, but Stevens went down. The arena exploded into chaos as the heavyweight champion of the world hit the canvas, his body crumpling under the weight of the fight. The ref started the count, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. 1, 2. Stevens was struggling to get up, his arms shaking as he tried to push himself off the ground. 3, 4. I stood there, my chest heaving, my fist still raised, watching as the champ fought to stay in the fight. But I could see it in his eyes. He was done. 5, 6. Stevens' body slumped back down to the canvas, his strength finally giving out. 7, 8. The ref's voice was clear now, cutting through the noise. 9. Stevens didn't move. 10. The bell rang, and the fight was over. When the final bell rang, the sound didn't register at first. It was like my mind had been swimming through fog for the last few minutes, and now everything was pulling back into focus. The crowd erupted, the arena shaking with the sheer force of their voices, but all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked down at Stevens, still on the canvas, motionless. The ref was leaning over him, counting out the final seconds as if each number was a hammer driving in the reality of what had just happened. I had done it. The ref raised his hand, signaling the end of the fight, and Tony was suddenly by my side, his arms grabbing me, pulling me close. I could hear him shouting, but the words blurred together. All I knew was that I was still standing. Barely. My legs were shaking, my body screaming in pain, but I hadn't gone down. I hadn't quit. Stevens lay on the ground for what felt like an eternity, the crowd shifting from wild screams to a quiet, tense murmur. No one was used to seeing him like this, least of all him. I could see it in his eyes when they finally opened, confusion, disbelief, and a tinge of fear. He sat up slowly, the doctors rushing to his side, checking for any lasting damage. His face was battered, swollen, and his eyes were unfocused. This was a man who had never expected to lose. And yet here we were. The ref raised my hand, and I barely had the strength to lift it. The announcement came over the speakers, but the words didn't seem real. And the winner, by knockout in the 7th round, Vinny Moretti! My name boomed across the arena, and the place exploded. The noise was deafening, the lights blinding, but all I could do was stand there, soaking in the moment, barely able to process what had just happened. Tony was still shouting, his voice cracking from the strain of it. "You did it, Vinny! You did it!" He slapped my back hard, his hands shaking with excitement. He was grinning like a madman, his eyes wild with pride and disbelief. But I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my head spinning. I looked over to the corner, where Maria stood, her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She was crying, but it wasn't sadness. It was relief, joy, pride. I had done what no one thought possible, least of all me. I stumbled forward, my legs barely supporting me, and Maria rushed into the ring. She threw her arms around me, her sobs muffled against my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her as tight as I could. For a moment, everything else disappeared, the pain, the noise, the chaos. It was just the two of us, standing in the middle of the ring, together. "You did it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You really did it." I nodded, my face buried in her hair. "I told you I'd come back to you." The rest of the world seemed to fade into the background as we stood there. The cameras were flashing, reporters shouting questions, but none of it mattered. For that moment, all that mattered was that I had proven myself. Not just to the crowd, not just to Stevens, but to me. Tony eventually pulled me away from Maria, guiding me toward the edge of the ring where a reporter had a microphone shoved in my face. My body felt like it was on autopilot, moving without my mind's permission, still running on the adrenaline from the fight. "Vinny, how does it feel?" the reporter asked, his face eager, leaning in too close. I blinked, still trying to process everything. My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I don't know, it doesn't feel real yet." The reporter grinned, like he knew exactly what to say to push the moment even further. "You've just defeated the heavyweight champion of the world, Vinny. People are calling this one of the biggest upsets in boxing history. Did you think you could do it?" I glanced over at Stevens, who was still sitting in his corner, surrounded by his team. He looked broken. Not just physically, but mentally. And for a moment, I felt bad for him. He was a champion, no doubt about it. He had earned his place at the top. But today, I had been stronger. Today, I had wanted it more. "I don't know what I thought," I said, the words coming out slowly, like they were dragging themselves up from deep inside me. "I just knew I wasn't going to quit." Tony was beside me, cutting in before I could say anything else. He was basking in the glory, smiling for the cameras, talking about the next steps, the future, the endless possibilities. But for me, all I could think about was how tired I was. I wasn't thinking about titles or money or fame. All I wanted was to get out of the ring, go home, and collapse. As the post-fight madness continued, with more interviews, more photos, and more noise, I found myself staring out into the crowd. My mom was there, standing at the edge of the arena, her hands clasped together, tears running down her cheeks. She was smiling, that soft, proud smile she always gave me when I did something right. I lifted my hand, giving her a small wave, and she nodded back, her eyes filled with pride. It hit me then, the weight of everything I had just accomplished. I had won. I had defied the odds. I had gone up against the best, and I hadn't just survived, I had triumphed. But even in that moment, with all the noise and all the celebration, I knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something bigger. Something harder. As I climbed out of the ring, my body screaming in protest with every step, I realized that I wasn't the same guy who had stepped in there an hour ago. I was different now. I had faced down the impossible and come out the other side. But what did that mean for my future? The thought nagged at the back of my mind as I walked through the tunnel. Tony still talking a mile a minute beside me, Maria holding my hand tightly. Everyone was talking about the next big fight, the next opportunity, but all I could think about was what came after the fight. What did I do now? I had spent my entire life fighting, clawing my way out of the gutter, trying to prove to myself and everyone else that I was worth something. Now that I had done it, what was left? The thought scared me more than the fight had. The unknown. The future. But as we stepped out into the cool night air, the noise of the arena fading behind us, I realized something else. No matter what came next, no matter how hard the road ahead might be, I had already proven that I could stand tall. I could face whatever life threw at me, and I could fight. And that was enough for now. Tony was already talking about contracts and endorsements, but I'd barely heard him. Maria squeezed my hand, her eyes searching mine for some sign of what I was feeling. "You okay?" she asked softly. I smiled, pulling her close. "Yeah, I think I am." And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. The days after the fight were a blur. It felt like I was living someone else's life. Everywhere I went, people recognized me. My face was on the front of every newspaper, sports magazine, and TV show. I couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping me, shaking my hand, or asking for a picture. Vinny Moretti, the underdog who had knocked out the heavyweight champion, had become a household name overnight. Tony, of course, was loving every minute of it. He was always on the phone, talking to promoters, setting up interviews, and negotiating deals. The fight had changed everything for him too. He wasn't just some small-time manager anymore. He was the guy who had taken me all the way to the top, and now everyone wanted a piece of us. But for me, the fame didn't feel real. It was like I was living in a dream, and any moment I would wake up and find myself back in the dingy gym, working odd jobs just to get by. The idea that I was now someone people looked up to, someone they admired, didn't make sense to me. I was still the same Vinny. I still got up early to train, still felt the same aches and pains in my body, and still had that nagging feeling that none of this was going to last. After the fight, I didn't have much time to recover before the offers started pouring in. Tony was constantly talking about the next big match. Everyone wanted to see if I could do it again. The fight promoters wanted a rematch with Stevens, and they were willing to pay big money for it. "Think about it, Vinny," Tony would say, pacing around my apartment, his excitement barely contained. "This could be the biggest payday of your life. Stevens is hungry for it. He wants redemption, and the public's dying to see it. You knocked him out, but he's still the champ in their eyes. Beat him again, and there's no denying you're the best." I listened to him, nodded at the right moments, but inside I wasn't sure. The fight with Stevens had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. I'd won, but it had come at a cost. Every part of me had been pushed to the limit, and my body still hadn't fully recovered. My ribs were still sore, and the constant throbbing in my knuckles reminded me of just how close I had come to breaking down in that ring. And then there was the mental toll. Winning had been everything to me, proving to myself that I could do it, that I wasn't just some nobody from the streets. But now that I had won, I wasn't sure what was left. I felt empty, like the fight had been the only thing keeping me going, and without it, I was lost. Maria noticed it before anyone else. She saw the way I would sit at the kitchen table, staring off into space, my mind miles away. She tried to talk to me about it, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I was feeling. How do you tell someone that your greatest victory felt hollow? That after years of struggling, you weren't sure of who you were without the fight? "Maybe you need a break," Maria said one night, her hand resting gently on mine. "You've been going non-stop for so long, Vinny. Maybe it's time to take a step back, figure out what you really want." I knew she was right, but there was a part of me that was terrified of slowing down. In the world of boxing, if you weren't moving forward, you were falling behind. If I took a break, if I stopped fighting, would people forget about me? Would I go back to being that nobody, scraping by in the shadows? The thought gnawed at me. Then there was Tony. He was relentless, constantly pushing me toward the next fight, the next big payday. I could see the dollar signs in his eyes, the hunger for more. And why wouldn't he be excited? He had invested years in me, and now we were finally at the top. But Tony wasn't the one who had to step into the ring and put his body on the line. He wasn't the one who had to live with the pain, the exhaustion, the doubts. One morning, a few weeks after the fight, Tony showed up at the gym, his usual grin plastered on his face. "Vinny, I got great news," he said, waving a stack of papers in front of me. "Stevens' team is ready for the rematch. The contract's almost done, and we're looking at a 7-figure deal." 7 figures, Vinny! This is what we've been working for. I didn't say anything at first, just kept wrapping my hands, my mind churning. Tony went on about the logistics, the timing, the money, but all I could think about was stepping back into the ring with Stevens. I remembered the way his punches had felt, the way my body had screamed in pain after every round. And then I remembered the look in his eyes after I knocked him down. The anger, the humiliation. Stevens wasn't going to come back for a friendly rematch. He was coming back for revenge, and I knew that if I stepped into that ring again, it would be a war. "Vinny, are you listening to me?" Tony's voice cut through my thoughts. I looked up at him, my hands still halfway wrapped. "Yeah, I'm listening." "So? What do you think?" "This is it, man. This is the fight that's going to cement your legacy. You beat him again, and there's no one left who can say you're not the real champ." I nodded slowly, but the words felt heavy in my mouth. "I don't know, Tony. I'm not sure if I'm ready to get back in the ring just yet." Tony's smile faltered for a second, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "You're ready. You've been ready. You beat the guy once, you can do it again. What's holding you back?" I shrugged, trying to find the right words. "It's not that simple. I'm still recovering, and honestly, I'm not sure if I want to jump right back into it. Tony's expression darkened, his smile fading completely. What are you talking about, Vinny? This is what we've been working for. You've got a shot at making history here. You can't just walk away now. I'm not walking away, I said quickly, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure if I believed them. I just need some time, Tony. That fight took everything out of me. Tony's frustration was clear now. He threw the stack of papers onto the bench beside me, shaking his head. Time? What are you talking about, time? Boxing doesn't wait, Vinny. You take too long, and someone else is going to step in and take your place. You don't have the luxury of time. This is it. This is your moment. I could feel the tension between us building, and I knew Tony didn't understand. How could he? For him, the fight was about business, about money and opportunity. But for me, it was something deeper. It was about survival. It was about proving to myself that I was more than just a boxer. And right now, I wasn't sure if getting back in the ring was what I needed. I just need to think about it, I said, standing up and unwrapping my hands. Give me a few days. Tony didn't say anything for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for some sign of weakness, something he could argue against. But all he did was sigh, running a hand through his hair. All right, Vinny. But don't take too long. The world's watching. He turned and walked out of the gym, leaving me standing there, feeling more lost than ever. For the next few days, I tried to clear my head, but everywhere I went, I was reminded of the fight, of the pressure to step back into the ring. I couldn't escape it. Reporters hounded me for interviews, fans stopped me on the street, and Tony kept calling, asking if I had made up my mind. But I hadn't. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. I knew I had to fight eventually. That was who I was, that's what I did. But I also knew that if I didn't take the time to figure out what I wanted, I'd end up back in the same cycle, fighting for everyone else but myself. Then, one evening, Maria and I sat together on the couch, the city lights flickering outside our window. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. You don't have to do this, you know, she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. I know, I replied, though I wasn't sure if I really did. You've already proven everything you needed to. She continued. You've fought your whole life, Vinny. Maybe it's time to fight for something else. For us. For your future. Her words hung in the air, and I realized how much weight they carried. I had been so focused on the next fight, the next challenge, that I hadn't stopped to think about what came after. For years, boxing had been everything to me, but now, with Maria by my side, with the taste of victory still fresh in my mouth, I started to wonder if maybe there was more to life than just the fight. But could I really walk away? Could I leave behind the one thing that had defined me for so long? Boxing was more than just a sport to me, it was survival. It was how I had fought my way out of the streets, how I had clawed and scratched to make a name for myself when nobody thought I could. Without it, who was I? That question gnawed at me for days, lingering in the back of my mind as I went about my routine. I still trained every morning, still pushed my body to its limits, but there was a cloud hanging over everything. The clarity I once felt when my fist connected with the bag was gone, replaced by doubt and confusion. And Tony wasn't helping. Every time he called, his voice was more urgent, more desperate, like he could feel me slipping away. Vinny, you're running out of time, he would say, his words clipped and harsh. Steven's team isn't going to wait forever. They're already talking to other fighters. If you don't take this rematch, someone else will. I knew he was right. Boxing was a business, and opportunities didn't wait around for anyone. But the idea of stepping back into the ring, especially with Stevens, didn't sit right with me. Not yet. One afternoon, Maria convinced me to take a break from it all. Let's get out of the city, she said, her eyes full of concern. Just for a day. Clear your head. I resisted at first, but deep down, I knew she was right. I needed space. Away from the gym, away from the noise, away from the constant pressure that had been building like a weight on my chest. So, we packed a few things and drove out of the city, heading toward the quiet countryside where the air was cleaner and the sky seemed bigger. We found a small park by a lake, surrounded by trees that were just starting to turn with the early fall. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. We walked along the shore, Maria's hand in mine, neither of us saying much. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. After a while, we found a spot to sit, and I watched the water ripple gently in the breeze. It was so different from the roar of the crowds, the chaos of the ring. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. I don't know if I can do it again, I finally admitted, the words coming out slower than I expected. Maria looked at me, her expression soft but knowing. You don't have to. But what if I do? I asked, the uncertainty in my voice surprising even me. What if this is all I've got? She squeezed my hand, her gaze never wavering. Vinny, boxing doesn't define you. It never has. You're more than that. I wanted to believe her, but part of me wasn't so sure. For so long, I had been Vinny Moretti, the boxer, the fighter. Without that, who was I? A part of me was afraid that if I walked away now, I'd be nothing. Just another guy who had his moment of glory and then disappeared. I'm scared, I admitted, the words catching in my throat. Maria leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. It's okay to be scared. But you don't have to fight for them. You've already proved you can do it. Now you just have to figure out what you want. I thought about her words long after we left the park and drove back into the city. What did I want? Did I want the fame, the money, the constant pressure to be the best? Or did I just want to be happy, to live a life where I didn't have to wake up every morning with the weight of the world on my shoulders? The days passed, and with each one, the decision weighed heavier on me. I could feel Tony growing impatient, though he never said it outright. But I could hear it in his voice when we talked, the way he kept reminding me that the window was closing, that Stevens wasn't going to wait forever. And yet, every time I thought about signing that contract, my gut twisted. Something wasn't right. Then, one night, I got a call that changed everything. It was late, and Maria and I had just settled in for the night when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to pick it up. Vinny Moretti? The voice on the other end was gruff, unfamiliar. Yeah, who's this? There was a pause, then the man spoke again, his tone more serious now. This is Tony's brother, Sal. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't seen or heard from Sal in years, not since the days when Tony and I were scraping by, hustling our way through the underground boxing scene. Sal had always been the older brother, the one who stayed out of the spotlight but pulled strings behind the scenes. He was the guy you didn't want to mess with, the guy who always seemed to have connections to people you didn't want to cross. I need to talk to you about Tony, Sal said, his voice low. Immediately, my heart sank. What's going on? It's bad, Vinny. Tony's gotten himself into some trouble. Big trouble. I sat up in bed, my mind racing. What kind of trouble? Money trouble. He's in deep with some people. You know how it goes, betting on fights, trying to make a quick buck. But he's been betting against you. The words hit me like a freight train. Tony? Betting against me? The guy who had been by my side through thick and thin, who had pushed me to the top? What the hell are you talking about? I asked, my voice rising. I'm telling you, Vinny. Tony's in over his head. He's been making bets on your fights, trying to cash in. And now, he owes a lot of money. More than he can pay. That's why he's been pushing you so hard for this rematch with Stevens. He's counting on it to bail him out. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. Everything started to make sense. The pressure, the urgency, the way Tony had been acting lately. He wasn't just looking out for my career. He was trying to save himself. You're serious? I asked, my voice barely steady. Dead serious, Sal replied. And if he doesn't get the money, these people, they don't mess around, Vinny. They'll come for him. The room seemed to spin around me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Tony, my manager, my friend, had been using me, risking everything for his own gain. And now, because of him, I was being pulled into a mess I didn't even know existed. "What do they want from me?" I asked, my voice cold. "They want the fight," Sal said simply. "If you take the rematch and win, Tony's debts get cleared. But if you don't, well, I don't need to spell it out for you." I hung up the phone without saying another word, my mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and confusion. Tony had put me in an impossible situation, and now, I was the one who had to clean up his mess. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had spent my entire life fighting for myself, for my future, and now, I was being forced into a fight I didn't even want, just to save Tony from his own mistakes. Maria sat beside me, her hand on my arm, waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. "What are you going to do?" she asked softly, her voice full of concern. I shook my head, feeling lost for the first time in a long time. "I don't know." But deep down, I knew there was only one choice. I had to take the fight. Not for the glory, not for the money, but to protect the people I cared about. Even if Tony had betrayed me, I couldn't let him fall into the hands of the people he owed. I couldn't live with that on my conscience. So, I made the call the next morning. I told Tony I was in. The rematch with Stevens was back on. But this time, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for something far more dangerous, far more complicated. And as the date for the fight drew closer, the weight of that decision pressed down on me harder than any punch I'd ever taken. The moment I made the decision, everything seemed to speed up. Tony was ecstatic, acting like we just won the lottery. He didn't know that I knew about the trouble he was in, and I didn't let on. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. I needed to stay focused, because what was coming wasn't just a rematch. It was something much bigger, and much more dangerous. Training for the rematch was different this time. It wasn't just about getting in shape or preparing to take on Stevens again. This time, I had a cloud hanging over me, a sense of dread that followed me everywhere I went. Every time I stepped into the gym, the weight of the situation would hit me. I wasn't just fighting for my career, or even for Tony. I was fighting for my life. Maria could sense the change in me. She knew I was carrying more than just the pressure of the fight, but I didn't want to burden her with the details. I kept the truth about Tony to myself, even though every time I looked at her, I wanted to spill everything. She didn't deserve to be caught up in this mess, but she was already in it, just like me. The only difference was, she didn't know how deep it really went. Tony was more present during this training camp than he had ever been before. He was at every session, shouting out instructions, pushing me harder than ever. It wasn't just about winning this time. He knew what was on the line for him, and he wasn't going to let me forget it. "Stevens is coming for blood," Tony would say, pacing the gym as I pounded the heavy bag. "He wants revenge, Vinny. You embarrass him in front of the whole world, and he's not going to stop until he puts you down." I knew Tony was right. I'd seen the interviews Stevens had done since our last fight, his face hard, his words dripping with anger and determination. The knockout had hit him deeper than just physically, it had shattered his pride. He'd been the undefeated champion, and I had taken that from him. Now, he wanted to prove it was a fluke. He wanted to make an example of me. As the weeks went by, the media frenzy built around the rematch. Everywhere I turned, there were cameras, reporters, and questions. They asked about my strategy, about how I felt facing Stevens again, but every question felt like an interrogation, digging into my doubts and fears. They didn't know the real story, the one that was happening behind the scenes. They didn't know that Tony's life was on the line, and mine too, in a way. All they saw was the spectacle of the fight, the drama of two men going head-to-head again in what they were already calling the fight of the century. I tried to stay focused on my training, but every time I wrapped my hands, every time I stepped into the ring to spar, the same questions ran through my mind. Could I do it again? Could I beat Stevens a second time, knowing what was at stake? The first fight had been a miracle. one of those rare moments where everything aligned perfectly. I had pushed myself harder than ever before, and it had paid off. But now I wasn't sure if I had it in me to go through that kind of war again. Stevens was training like a madman, too. I saw the footage on the news, him sparring with some of the best fighters in the world, his punches harder and faster than ever. He looked like a man possessed, and in a way, he was. He had something to prove, and that made him more dangerous than ever. One night, after a long day of training, I found myself sitting alone in the locker room, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I barely recognized the person looking back at me. My body was battered, my face gaunt from the relentless training. But it wasn't just the physical toll that had changed me. It was the weight of everything I was carrying. The fight with Stevens, the pressure from Tony, the secret about the debts. It was all crushing me, bit by bit. As I sat there, lost in thought, Tony walked in. He had a habit of showing up when I least expected it, like he could sense when I was at my breaking point. "You good?" he asked, sitting down on the bench next to me. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how to. How could I explain the storm of emotions swirling inside me? "I don't know," I finally said, my voice low. Tony leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He didn't look at me right away, just stared at the floor. "Listen, Vinny. I know this is a lot. I know I've been pushing you hard, but you have to understand something. This fight, it's everything. For both of us." I glanced at him, the words from Sal's phone call echoing in my mind. Did Tony know that I was aware of the mess he had gotten himself into? That he was using me as his way out? "I'm doing this for you, Tony," I said, my voice steadier now. "But you need to tell me the truth. What's really going on?" Tony's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "I got a call from Sal," I said, watching his reaction closely. "He told me about the bets. About the money you owe." For a second, Tony's face went pale, but then he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "Sal shouldn't have said anything," he muttered. "But he did. So now I know." There was a long silence between us, the tension thick in the air. Tony rubbed a hand over his face, sighing heavily. "Look, Vinny, it's not what you think. Yeah, I made some bets. I took some risks, but it was never about screwing you over. I wanted to make sure we were set, you know? I've been in this game a long time, and I've seen guys like us come and go. I wanted to make sure that when all this was over, we'd both have something to show for it." His words didn't sit right with me. There was more to the story, and we both knew it. But now wasn't the time to get into it. The fight was too close, and I couldn't afford to let this drama distract me any more than it already had. "We'll talk about this after the fight," I said, standing up. "But for now, we focus on Stevens." Tony nodded, but I could tell he wasn't happy. He hated being cornered, especially by me. But there was nothing he could do. He knew I had the upper hand now. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this whole thing was spiraling out of control. And I was right in the middle of it. The night of the fight came faster than I expected. The arena was packed, the lights blinding as I walked toward the ring. The roar of the crowd was deafening, but it felt distant, like I was underwater. My heart pounded in my chest, but my mind was somewhere else, back in the locker room, back in that conversation with Tony, back in all the moments that had led me here. Stevens was already in the ring, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. He looked bigger, meaner than the last time we fought. His eyes were locked on me, full of hatred, full of a need to prove something. I could feel his intensity from across the ring, and it sent a chill down my spine. As I stepped into the ring, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. This wasn't just about winning or losing anymore. It wasn't just about the title. This was about survival, about making it through this fight with everything intact. My body, my mind, my future. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what was about to happen. The bell rang, and suddenly, there was no time to think. Stevens came at me like a freight train, his punches fast and brutal. I barely had time to react. dodging and blocking as best I could, but he was relentless. Every hit felt like a hammer to my ribs, every punch a reminder of what I was up against. He wasn't holding back this time. This was a fight to the death in his mind. But I fought back. I had to. There was no other option. Round after round, we traded blows, each one more punishing than the last. Blood dripped from my nose, my vision blurry from the swelling around my eyes. I could hear the crowd screaming, could see Tony on the edge of the ring, shouting instructions, but it was all a blur. The only thing that mattered was staying on my feet. But as the rounds dragged on, the exhaustion set in. My legs felt like lead, my arms heavy and slow. Stevens was wearing me down, little by little, and I could feel myself slipping. This fight was different from the first. He had learned from his mistakes, and now, he was picking me apart, waiting for the right moment to land the final blow. I couldn't let him. I couldn't let this be how it ended. Not like this. The 9th round started, and I could barely feel my legs. My lungs were burning, and every breath felt like fire. Stevens had turned this fight into a brutal war of attrition, a slow, methodical dismantling of everything I had worked for. His punches were like a drumbeat, relentless and powerful, each one pushing me closer to the edge. I could hear the crowd roaring, but it felt distant, like the world around me was fading away. Stevens wasn't just fighting to win the title back. No, he wanted more. He wanted to humiliate me, to break me in front of everyone, and I could see it in his eyes every time he landed a punch. He was getting stronger as I got weaker, and that's what scared me most. He wasn't wearing down like I was. He was thriving on the pain, feeding off my exhaustion. My corner was screaming at me to stay on the move, to keep circling, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Each time I tried to push off, my knees buckled, threatening to give out. I knew I couldn't take much more of this. My mind flashed back to all the training, the early mornings, the long days, and I realized just how far I had come. But now, here I was, seconds away from losing it all. Then, just as I thought I was done, I saw Maria. She was sitting in the front row, her eyes locked on me, her face tense but full of belief. She hadn't looked away once, even as Stevens pummeled me. Her presence pulled me back, like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. She wasn't there to see me fall. She was there to see me stand up and fight. A surge of energy ripped through me, something primal, something I didn't even know I had left. I snapped back to the moment, dodging a brutal right hook from Stevens that would have knocked me out cold. My feet moved faster than they had all fight, and I started to bob and weave, slipping his punches like I had in our first bout. I wasn't done. Not yet. Tony was yelling from the corner, his voice hoarse. "Stay in it, Vinny! Stay in it!" But I wasn't doing this for him. Not anymore. This wasn't about Tony's debts or Stevens' revenge. This was about me, about proving that no matter how much I got knocked down, I could still stand up. I threw a counterpunch that caught Stevens off guard. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that I wasn't going to roll over. He came at me again, this time with more anger, more frustration. He wasn't used to fighters lasting this long against him, especially after the beating he'd been handing out. I could see the cracks in his confidence starting to form, just like they had in the first fight. The bell rang, signaling the end of the round, and I stumbled back to my corner. My body felt like it was breaking down, but my mind was clear. I had survived another round, and now, there were only 3 more to go. Tony was right in my face the moment I sat down, dabbing at the cut over my eye while he barked out instructions. "You've got him, Vinny," he said, his voice fierce. "He's starting to fade. You just need to hold on a little longer." I didn't know if I believed him, but it didn't matter. I wasn't thinking about the rounds anymore. I was taking it punch by punch, moment by moment, just trying to survive. My arms felt like lead, and every inch of my body screamed at me to stop, but I refused to give up. Not now. As the 10th round began, Stevens charged at me with everything he had left. His punches were wild, desperate, and I realized he wasn't as fresh as he'd seemed earlier. He was feeling it, too, the weight of the fight, the exhaustion, the pressure to win. He had put everything into this, just like I had, and now, it was coming down to who wanted it more. We exchanged blows, each one harder than the last. My vision blurred, and I tasted blood in my mouth, but I kept going. I could hear Tony screaming from the corner, but his words were lost in the chaos. It was just me and Stevens now, two men in the middle of a war either of us could afford to lose. I landed a clean right hook that rocked Stevens, and for the first time in the fight, I saw fear flash in his eyes. He stumbled back, his confidence shaken, and I knew I had him. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up, but I wasn't going to stop now. I pressed forward, throwing everything I had into my punches, hoping it would be enough. But Stevens wasn't done yet. He fought back with a vicious uppercut that caught me square on the chin, sending me crashing to the canvas. The crowd erupted in a deafening roar, but all I could hear was the thud of my body hitting the mat. My head spun, my vision darkening as the referee started the count. 1, 2. Everything around me seemed to slow down. The noise, the lights, the people, it all faded into the background as I lay there, staring up at the ceiling. My body screamed at me to stay down, to let it end, but something inside me wouldn't let go. 3, 4. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. Tony's betrayal, Stevens' relentless drive, the expectations of everyone watching. But there was something else, too. A spark. A small, flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. It was Maria, sitting there in the front row, believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. 5, 6. With a groan, I forced my arms to move, pushing against the canvas. My legs trembled beneath me, barely able to hold me up, but I wasn't staying down. Not like this. I grabbed the ropes, pulling myself to my feet as the referee's count reached 8. The crowd exploded as I stood, swaying but still standing, my fists raised. Stevens' face twisted into a scowl as he realized I wasn't finished. He thought he had me, but I was still in this. The round ended before Stevens could launch another attack, and I staggered back to my corner. Tony was there, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked like he wanted to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I just held up my gloves, signaling that I was ready for the next round. The 11th round began, and everything felt like a blur. Every punch, every step felt like it was happening in slow motion. But somehow, I kept going. Stevens kept coming at me, but his punches weren't as sharp, his movements slower, sloppier. He was fading, and I could feel it. Then, something shifted. In the middle of the round, I caught him with a brutal combination, 2 hooks to the body followed by an uppercut that snapped his head back. Stevens stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him, and for the first time, I saw him fall. He hit the canvas hard, his eyes wide with shock as the referee began his count. I stood there, gasping for air, my body on the verge of collapse. The crowd was going wild, but all I could focus on was Stevens, lying on the mat, struggling to get up. The ref counted, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. 7, 8. Stevens pushed himself to his knees, his face twisted in pain and frustration. But he wasn't getting up. Not this time. 9, 10. The referee waved his arms, signaling the end of the fight. Stevens was done. I had won. The noise in the arena was deafening, but all I could do was stand there, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. My body ached, my face was swollen, but none of that mattered. I had survived. I had fought through everything, Stevens, Tony, the doubts, the pain, and I had come out on top. The moment felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. I raised my arms in victory, the adrenaline still coursing through me, but deep down, I knew this fight had been more than just another victory. It had been about proving something to myself, something I hadn't even realized I needed to prove. And as I looked out at the sea of faces, all cheering for me, I knew one thing for sure: no matter what happened next, I would never be the same again. But the story wasn't over. There were still loose ends to tie up. Tony. The debts. the aftermath of everything that had happened leading up to this moment. And now, I had to face it all. The celebration that erupted in the arena felt like a dream I couldn't fully grasp. The noise washed over me like a wave, but it was distant, muffled, as though I was hearing it from underwater. My body was numb, my mind foggy, but somehow I stayed standing as they raised my hand in victory. I could see the flashes of cameras, the blur of faces, and hear Tony's voice shouting my name, but it was all a haze. All I could think about was that I had done it. I had beaten Stevens, again. The rematch that everyone thought would end me, that I myself had doubted I could survive, was over, and I was still on my feet. Barely, but I was standing. Stevens had been helped to his corner, his face a mix of disbelief and fury. He hadn't expected this. No one had. But in the end, it didn't matter. He was no longer the unbeatable force he once was. He had been broken, and I had been the one to do it, twice. But even as the announcer declared me the victor, I felt no joy. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of relief. Instead, there was only exhaustion. Bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. I stumbled back to my corner, and Tony caught me before I could collapse. He was beaming, practically jumping out of his skin with excitement, but I could barely look at him. Every punch I had thrown, every step I had taken in that ring, had been for something bigger than just a fight. And now that it was over, I felt hollow. "Vinny, you did it!" Tony shouted, his voice hoarse from yelling. "You're the champ! You're the best, kid!" But I didn't feel like a champion. I felt like a man who had barely survived a storm. The roar of the crowd continued as they ushered me toward the locker room, cameras flashing in my face, reporters shouting questions I couldn't process. My vision blurred, and my legs threatened to give out with every step, but somehow, I made it through. Once I was inside the locker room, the noise finally faded. I sank onto the bench, my head in my hands, and let out a long breath. My body was screaming at me to rest, to lie down and never get up again, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The fight was over, but the real battle was just beginning. Tony burst into the locker room a few minutes later, grinning like he just won the lottery. His excitement filled the room, his energy almost manic. He slapped me on the back, laughing and shouting, "We did it, Vinny! We did it!" But I wasn't in the mood to celebrate. I looked up at him, my face grim, and said, "We need to talk." His grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, waving off my seriousness. "Come on, Vinny, we'll talk later. Let's enjoy this. You just won the biggest fight of your life." "No," I said, my voice firmer now. "We're talking now." Tony's smile faded completely, and he stopped pacing, realizing that this wasn't something he could brush off. He sat down on the bench across from me, his expression guarded. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out where this was going. I didn't waste any time. "I know about the money, Tony. I know about the debts." His eyes darted away, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What are you talking about, Vinny? This isn't the time." "Don't lie to me." I cut him off, my voice cold. "I talked to Sal. I know you've been gambling, that you're in deep with the wrong people." Tony looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed smaller, like the weight of his own mistakes had finally caught up with him. "I was trying to protect you," Tony muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Protect me?" I scoffed, standing up, my anger rising. "You put me in the middle of your mess. I fought tonight not just to win, but because I didn't have a choice. You put my life on the line to cover your bets, and you didn't even tell me." Tony stood too, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "I was going to fix it. I had a plan, Vinny, I swear. This fight, winning this fight, was going to clear everything. But what if I didn't win, Tony?" I shot back. "What then? What was going to happen to me if I lost?" The question hung in the air like a dark cloud, and Tony couldn't meet my eyes. He knew the answer, even if he didn't want to say it out loud. If I had lost, we both knew that things would have gone south fast. His debts weren't just numbers on a sheet. They were promises made to men who didn't forgive and forget. Men who wouldn't hesitate to come after him, or me. I didn't know how else to handle it, Tony finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I got in too deep, and before I realized it, I was trapped. The only way out was to bet on you, Vinny. You were my only hope. I shook my head, disgusted. You gambled with my life, Tony. You didn't even give me a choice. Tony dropped his head into his hands, the weight of his actions crushing him. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the air thick with tension and regret. I wanted to hate him, to walk away and never look back, but I couldn't. As angry as I was, Tony was still the man who had gotten me this far. He had trained me, believed in me when no one else had. But he had also betrayed me, and that was something I couldn't just forgive. What now? Tony asked quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't know what came next, or how we were supposed to move forward from this. All I knew was that things could never go back to the way they were. I don't know, I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. But this isn't over. Before Tony could respond, the door to the locker room creaked open, and Maria stepped inside. Her eyes immediately found mine, and for a moment, the world outside faded away. She crossed the room in a few quick steps, wrapping her arms around me without saying a word. I clung to her, feeling the warmth and strength in her embrace. She was my anchor, the one thing that kept me grounded in the middle of this storm. After a long moment, she pulled back, looking at me with a mix of concern and pride. You did it, Vinny, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. You won. I nodded, but there was no joy in it. Yeah, I said softly. But it doesn't feel like a victory. Maria's eyes searched mine, understanding the depth of what I meant. She knew about Tony's gambling, about the pressure I'd been under, and she had stood by me through it all. Now, in this moment of supposed triumph, she saw the cracks in everything. But she didn't press me. She just stayed by my side, her presence enough to keep me from falling apart. The night dragged on, with people coming and going, offering their congratulations, shaking my hand, and snapping photos. But I was only half present, my mind drifting through the chaos of everything that had led up to this moment. There was no escaping the mess I was in, and the fight in the ring was just one part of it. Now, I had to face the consequences of everything that had been hidden beneath the surface. Later, when the arena was finally quiet, and I was alone with Maria, I looked at her, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do, Maria. She took my hand, her grip strong and reassuring. We'll figure it out, Vinny. Together. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that everything could somehow work itself out. But deep down, I knew that the road ahead was still filled with danger and uncertainty. Tony's debts were still hanging over us, and the people he owed weren't the type to just forget. Winning the fight had bought us time, but not safety. And so, even though I had won in the ring, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still ahead. And it was going to be the toughest fight of my life. The aftermath of the fight settled like a heavy fog over me. It was strange how the exhilaration of victory could fade into something darker in the blink of an eye. The cheers and applause of the crowd echoed in my mind, but now they felt like distant memories. I was a champion, but I felt more like a pawn caught in a game that was far from over. Maria stayed by my side, her presence a comforting balm in the midst of chaos. We left the arena together, the cheers of the crowd fading as we stepped into the cool night air. The streets of Philadelphia were alive with energy, but I felt disconnected, as if I was watching life unfold from a distance. Are you okay? Maria asked softly, looking up at me with concern etched on her face. I wanted to assure her that I was fine, that I could handle everything that was coming, but the truth was that I felt overwhelmed. I don't know, I admitted. There's so much going on, and I don't even know where to start. Maria took my hand and squeezed it gently, her touch grounding me. One step at a time, Vinny. We'll figure it out. You don't have to do this alone. As we walked, I thought about Tony's debts, the looming threat of the people who wanted their money. I remembered the way his face had fallen when I confronted him, the guilt that had etched itself into his features. Despite everything, he was still my manager, and I had trusted him to guide me. Now I felt betrayed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a darkness I couldn't escape. We reached my apartment, a small place in a rundown building that had seen better days. It was quiet, too quiet, and the weight of everything I was facing settled on my shoulders as we stepped inside. The walls felt like they were closing in, reminders of the life I had fought so hard to escape. "Let's sit down for a minute," Maria suggested, leading me to the couch. "You need to rest." I sank down into the worn cushions, my mind racing. Maria sat beside me, her body close, and I leaned against her, finding comfort in her presence. I knew I should be feeling triumphant, but all I could think about were the challenges ahead. "Tony's in deep trouble, Maria," I said, my voice heavy. "And I'm not sure how to help him without getting dragged into it." She looked at me, her expression serious. "Have you talked to him about it?" "Yeah, but I don't trust him," I admitted. "He's been hiding things from me, gambling on fights without telling me. I feel like I'm just a way for him to pay off his debts." "Vinny, he's still your friend," she reminded me gently. "But you also need to protect yourself. Maybe you could talk to him again, see if there's a way to help without putting yourself at risk." I thought about her words, but I wasn't sure if I could face Tony again. What if he drags me down with him? I can't let that happen, especially after everything I've fought for. Maria took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against my arm. "You're not alone in this. You're a champion now, but you have to be smart about it. You need to think about your future." I nodded slowly, grateful for her support, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. My life had already been a constant fight, against the odds, against my own fears. But now I was stepping into a new arena, one that was just as dangerous, if not more so. As the night wore on, the adrenaline from the fight began to wear off, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness swallow me for a moment, trying to clear my mind. I thought of all the people who had supported me, Maria, my friends, even Tony, despite everything. They had all been there for me, and now I felt like I was letting them down. Hours passed, and finally I spoke up, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I go to Tony tomorrow, lay everything on the table? I need to know the truth, no more lies. Maybe we can figure this out together." Maria smiled softly, and for a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. "That sounds like a good plan. Just remember, you're not alone. You've got me, and you've got everyone else who believes in you." I squeezed her hand, feeling grateful for her unwavering support. As the weight of the world pressed down on me, I realized that I could still fight back, not just in the ring, but in my life. I had to confront the challenges ahead, and I had to do it with courage. The next day dawned, and as the sun rose over Philadelphia, I felt a renewed sense of determination. I got up early, the crisp morning air filling my lungs as I prepared for the day ahead. I had trained hard for my fights, but now I needed to prepare for something even more daunting: the conversation with Tony. As I walked through the familiar streets, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The world felt heavy, and the shadows of the past loomed large. I reached Tony's gym, the place where it all began, where I had trained tirelessly to achieve my dreams. Stepping inside, the familiar smell of sweat and leather hit me, and I felt a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. "Vinny!" Tony called out, his voice echoing off the walls. He looked up from where he was wiping down a heavy bag, a smile breaking across his face. But it faded quickly when he saw the expression on mine. "What's wrong? Can we talk?" I said, my tone serious. "Of course, what's up?" He wiped his hands on a towel and motioned for me to follow him to a quieter corner of the gym. As we settled onto a couple of stools, I could feel the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. I had to confront him about everything: the gambling, the debts, the lies. This was my chance to set things right. "Tony, I know about the money," I started, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I talked to Sal, and I need you to tell me everything." He sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck as he avoided my gaze. "I didn't want you to find out this way, Vinny. I was going to tell you, I swear. But I thought I could fix it." "Fix it?" I repeated, my anger rising. "How do you plan to fix it when you've already put my life on the line? You're not just gambling with money. You're gambling with my career." Tony looked up, his eyes filled with regret. "I know, and I'm sorry. I thought I could make a big win and pay it all off. I never wanted you to get involved in my mess." "Too late for that," I snapped, frustration boiling over. "You've already dragged me in, Tony. I need to know what we're facing. How deep is this?" He took a deep breath, his expression hardening. "It's bad, Vinny. I owe a lot of money to some people who don't take kindly to late payments. They've been breathing down my neck, and I can't keep dodging them." "Then we need a plan," I said, my mind racing. "I can't just stand by while you deal with this. We need to figure out how to pay them back without risking everything." Tony nodded slowly, his expression grave. "I've been thinking about that. If we can get you another fight, maybe even a title shot, it could buy us some time. I know it's risky, but it's our best shot." "A title shot?" I frowned, the idea already setting off alarm bells in my head. "What if I lose? What if they come after me for the money?" "They won't," Tony assured me, his voice firm. "You're the champion now, Vinny. You can't let fear dictate your decisions. You have to fight, and you have to win." I leaned back, crossing my arms as I considered his words. He was right. I couldn't let fear control me. But I also couldn't ignore the dangers that loomed ahead. The stakes were higher than ever, and I had to tread carefully. "All right," I finally said, my voice steady. "I'll consider it. But I need you to promise me that you'll come clean with everything. No more secrets, no more lies. I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Tony looked me in the eye, his expression serious. "I promise, Vinny. No more hiding. I'll lay it all out for you, and we'll figure this out together." As we shook hands, I felt a small flicker of hope ignite within me. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was still fraught with danger, but we had a plan. Together, we would fight, not just in the ring, but for our lives, our future, and everything we had worked so hard to achieve. But as the weight of the world pressed down on my shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that the toughest battle was still to come. The looming threat of those debts hung over me like a storm cloud, waiting to burst. And I knew that no matter what happened next, I would have to fight harder than I ever had before. The final showdown was on the horizon, and I was determined to face it head-on. I had trained hard, fought tooth and nail, and now I was ready to take on the greatest challenge of my life, not just in the ring but against the dark forces that loomed outside it. Days turned into weeks as I dove back into training, pushing my body and mind to their limits. The gym became my sanctuary, a place where I could channel my anger, fear, and determination into something tangible. Every punch I threw at the heavy bag was a reminder of everything I had fought for, my dreams, my freedom, and the people I cared about. Maria stood by my side, a constant source of support and motivation. She would come to the gym every day, sitting in the corner and watching as I trained. Her unwavering belief in me bolstered my confidence, and I fought not just for myself, but for her as well. I wanted to create a future where we could finally escape the shadows of our past. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a particularly grueling session, Tony walked in, looking more haggard than usual. "Vinny, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. I wiped the sweat from my brow and nodded, sensing the weight of his words. "What's going on?" He motioned for me to follow him outside, away from the noise of the gym. We stood in the alley behind the building, the sounds of the city echoing around us. "I've been talking to some people," he began, his eyes darting nervously. "The guys I owe money to, they want their cash, and they want it now." A pit formed in my stomach. "How much do they want?" 30,000, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And they want it within a week." I tried to negotiate. but they're not in a mood to compromise. They're serious, Vinny. If we don't pay up, they'll come after both of us. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. $30,000 was an astronomical sum, especially given the situation we were in. We can't just come up with that kind of money overnight, Tony. What are we going to do? Tony's face hardened. We need that title shot. If we can secure a fight with the reigning champion, the prize money could cover my debts and give you a chance to solidify your place as a champion. But it's going to be tough. They're going to want to see you in action again before they agree to anything. I took a deep breath, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders. This was more than just a fight. It was a chance to reclaim our lives from the grips of those who sought to drag us down. I'll do it, I said, determination hardening my resolve. I'll fight for the title. Tony looked relieved, a flicker of hope in his eyes. You have what it takes, Vinny. You've already proven that. But we need to be strategic about this. We can't just jump into the ring without a plan. Let's start training harder than ever, I replied. We can't afford to take any chances. We have to be ready for anything. The days flew by in a blur of training and preparation. My routine became a relentless cycle of sweat, pain, and determination. I trained with Tony, focusing on refining my technique, working on my footwork, and building my stamina. Every morning I would run through the streets of Philadelphia, pushing my body to its limits, feeling the energy of the city pulsing around me. Maria stayed by my side, offering words of encouragement, helping me stay focused on my goals. She was my rock, reminding me that I wasn't fighting alone. Her unwavering support became my lifeline, and I drew strength from her belief in me. As we worked towards the title fight, we began to develop a strategy for how to approach it. We reached out to promoters and managers, networking within the boxing community, and soon enough, we secured a title shot against the reigning champion, a fierce fighter known as the Beast. The Beast was notorious for his knockout power and aggressive style, but I had learned to channel my fear into determination. I had fought against the odds before, and I would do it again. I knew I had what it took to win, but I also understood the stakes were higher this time. The night of the fight arrived, and the arena buzzed with energy. The air was thick with anticipation, the crowd roaring in excitement as I made my way to the ring. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins. This was it, the moment I had fought so hard for, not just for the title, but for my future. As I stepped into the ring, the lights flashed around me, and I caught a glimpse of Maria in the crowd, her eyes shining with pride and encouragement. I felt a surge of determination wash over me, knowing I had to give it my all. The bell rang, and the fight began. The Beast came out swinging, his fists flying with incredible speed and power. I dodged and weaved, relying on my training to keep me one step ahead. I could feel the energy of the crowd lifting me, their cheers urging me to keep going. Round after round, the fight progressed, and I found my rhythm. I absorbed the hits, countering with precision, my body moving instinctively. Each time I landed a punch, I could feel the tide turning in my favor. But the Beast was relentless. He pressed forward, refusing to back down, and I could feel the exhaustion creeping in. Every blow felt heavier, and I struggled to keep my focus. In the back of my mind, the looming threat of Tony's debts hung over me, fueling my determination to win. In the final rounds, the fight reached a fever pitch. Both of us were bloodied and battered, but I could sense that I was starting to wear him down. With each punch I threw, I remembered the people who had supported me, the sacrifices we had all made to get to this point. As the final round approached, the arena erupted into a frenzy. The crowd was on their feet, chanting my name, and I felt a surge of energy. With a final push, I summoned every ounce of strength I had left. I charged forward, throwing a flurry of punches that connected with the Beast in rapid succession. Time seemed to slow as I delivered one final, devastating blow to his jaw, sending him crashing to the canvas. The referee began the count, and I stood in the center of the ring, my heart pounding in my chest, holding my breath as the crowd roared around me. 1, 2, 3. The count echoed in my ears, and I could hardly believe what was happening. The referee continued counting, and I could feel the weight of my victory hanging in the balance. 4, 5, 6. And then, just as I thought it was over, the beast stirred, pushing himself off the mat, his eyes wild with determination. But I wouldn't let up. I had come too far to lose now. As he rose, I charged forward, throwing everything I had into one last combination of punches. I could feel the power coursing through my body, the culmination of all my hard work and dedication. With a final, resounding left hook, I sent him tumbling back down, and this time, there was no getting up. The referee counted again, his voice echoing in the arena. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The arena erupted in cheers, the roar of the crowd washing over me like a wave. I had done it. I had won the title. As the referee raised my hand in victory, I could hardly believe it. The weight of the world lifted off my shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. As I looked out at the sea of faces, I caught sight of Maria, her eyes shining with pride and joy. I knew that this victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to all of us. Later that night, as the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of my victory settled in, I found myself standing outside the arena with Tony and Maria. The night air was crisp, and I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. "Vinny, you did it!" Tony exclaimed, a wide smile stretching across his face. "You're a champion!" "Yeah, but what now?" I asked, the reality of my situation creeping back in. "What about the money? What do we do about your debts?" Tony's smile faltered for a moment, the gravity of our situation returning. "I'll take care of it," he promised. "I'll pay them off with the prize money. You've done your part, now let me handle the rest." I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "You'd better keep your word, Tony. I can't afford to lose everything we've worked for." "I will, I promise," he assured me, his eyes sincere. "We're in this together, Vinny. You've earned this, and I'll do everything I can to make it right." Maria stepped forward, her hand on my shoulder. "You've fought so hard, Vinny. This is just the beginning. We'll figure it out together, I know we will." As I looked between the two of them, I felt a sense of hope. Yes, there were challenges ahead, but I had faced challenges before, and I had emerged victorious. I was a champion now, and with that came a new responsibility, to protect the life. The aftermath of the fight left me feeling both exhilarated and cautious. The thrill of victory coursed through my veins, but the shadow of Tony's debts loomed large over our heads. The night after the fight, I sat in my apartment with Maria, replaying the events in my mind, the excitement of the crowd still echoing in my ears. "Can you believe it?" Maria asked, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You did it, Vinny! You're a champion now." I smiled at her, the warmth of her encouragement enveloping me. "Yeah, it feels amazing. But we need to focus on what comes next." The following day, Tony and I met to discuss the plans for the prize money. He had already started making arrangements to settle his debts. I could see the weight lifting off his shoulders as he realized we were finally on the right track. "I reached out to Sal," Tony explained as we sat at a small diner, the smell of fresh coffee and breakfast filling the air. "He agreed to give me a few days to settle the score. With your winnings, we should be able to pay him back and get this monkey off our backs." "Good," I replied, feeling a rush of relief. "I don't want this hanging over us anymore. I want to move forward, not look back." Tony nodded, his expression serious. "I know I made some mistakes, Vinny. But I'll make it right, I promise. You've done so much for me, I want to help you now." Maria chimed in. "And you both can focus on training for the next fight. This one opens up new opportunities for you, Vinny. We can start talking to promoters about upcoming matches." I appreciated her optimism, but a part of me remained wary. "Yeah, but I need to be careful. I don't want to dive back into anything without a plan. I need to make sure I'm ready." Tony clapped me on the back. You're more than ready. You just won a title, Vinny. Now we'll get you a defense match lined up. You're the champion. You need to defend that title. As we discussed potential opponents and training strategies, a sense of excitement built within me. I felt energized by the possibilities ahead. Over the next few weeks, things started to fall into place. Tony settled his debts, ensuring that we were finally free from the financial stranglehold that had haunted us for so long. He worked tirelessly, making calls and negotiating with everyone involved. It was a relief to see him so focused and dedicated. Meanwhile, my training intensified. I spent countless hours in the gym, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. Maria was always there, offering her support, her presence a steady reminder of why I fought so hard. With each day, I felt more confident and empowered. The ring became my sanctuary, and the roar of the crowd filled me with adrenaline. I learned to channel my fears and doubts into determination, using them as fuel to propel me forward. As the date for my title defense approached, I could sense the anticipation building. Fans were eager to see how I would fare against the new challenger, and the media was buzzing with excitement. I was no longer just a fighter with potential. I was now a champion with something to prove. One night, after a particularly intense training session, I sat with Maria on the rooftop of my apartment building, the city skyline stretching out before us. The stars twinkled overhead, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. "Do you think I can do this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if I lose?" She turned to me, her gaze steady. "Vinny, you've already proven yourself. You've fought through so much to get here. Just remember, it's not about winning or losing. It's about how you fight and who you fight for. And you have a whole team behind you." I took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. I felt the weight of expectation lift, replaced by the warmth of belief. "You're right. I can't let fear hold me back." As I prepared for the upcoming fight, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the title anymore. It was about the journey I had taken, the people who had supported me, and the life I was building with Maria. I wanted to be more than just a champion. I wanted to be a fighter who inspired others. With each passing day, I grew stronger, not just physically, but mentally as well. I visualized my victory, picturing myself holding the championship belt high above my head as the crowd roared in approval. I could already feel the thrill of that moment, and it pushed me to work even harder. The night of the title defense arrived, and as I stood in the ring, I could feel the electric atmosphere surrounding me. The lights shone bright, illuminating the sweat on my brow and the determination in my heart. I was ready. As the bell rang, the roar of the crowd faded into the background, and all that mattered was the fight ahead. I had trained for this moment, and I wouldn't let anything distract me. But just as the match began, the ground beneath my feet shifted again. In the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of a figure that sent a chill down my spine, a man in the crowd, eyes locked on me with an intensity that felt all too familiar. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over yet. The fight commenced, and as the rounds progressed, I focused on my opponent. He was skilled, aggressive, but I had been through too much to back down now. I danced around him, landing quick jabs, my heart racing with adrenaline. But as the fight wore on, the stranger's presence loomed in my mind, a constant distraction that pulled my focus. The final round approached, and with each punch thrown, I could feel the weight of expectation growing heavier. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about everything I had worked for, everyone who had believed in me. I needed to win, not just for myself, but for Maria, for Tony, and for all the people who had stood by my side. And just when I thought I had the upper hand, the familiar figure in the crowd moved, slipping out of sight, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Was this just a distraction, or was there something more behind it? I pushed those thoughts aside. I had to stay focused. With a final surge of energy, I threw a powerful combination that sent my opponent reeling. The referee stepped in to separate us, and I knew this was my moment. With everything I had, I delivered one last blow that connected squarely. The bell rang, and the arena erupted in cheers. I had done it again. I had defended my title. The rush of victory flooded through me, and I knew that this time it felt different. As I celebrated with Tony and Maria, I glanced towards the crowd, searching for that figure. But he was gone, leaving only a lingering feeling of unease. What had I just fought against? What dangers still lurked in the shadows? But tonight was about celebrating my win, not letting the worries take over. I had accomplished so much, and as I stood in the ring, I raised my arms in triumph, soaking in the cheers. I had proven my strength, and I was ready to face whatever came next. The celebration continued long into the night, but my thoughts were clouded with questions. I had defended my title, and the thrill of victory was exhilarating, but the shadow of that figure still lingered in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the joy around me, but a part of me felt unsettled. Maria noticed my distraction as we walked out of the arena, her hand intertwined with mine. "You did amazing out there, Vinny! I'm so proud of you!" She beamed, her eyes shining. "Thanks, Maria. I just can't help but feel like something's off," I admitted, my gaze scanning the crowd around us. "Did you see that guy? The one watching me during the fight?" She frowned, her brow furrowing with concern. "No, I didn't." "But what do you mean? Did he look familiar?" "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head. "It was just a feeling. I can't shake the idea that something isn't right." Tony caught up to us, a wide grin plastered on his face. "Vinny, you're a legend. We need to celebrate this win. Drinks on me." I forced a smile, but my mind was elsewhere. "Yeah, let's celebrate," I said, trying to keep my tone upbeat. I couldn't let my worries spoil the night. As we made our way to a local bar, I felt the tension in my body ease slightly. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and cheers. Friends and fans congratulated me, and for a moment, I felt like I was on top of the world. After a few drinks and a lot of laughter, I began to relax. The cheers of the crowd replayed in my mind, and I reveled in the feeling of victory. I shared stories with Tony about the fight, and as the night wore on, I could feel the camaraderie and support surrounding me. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure from the crowd wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something about that presence nagged at me, and I knew I had to address it. The next morning, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The city was waking up, the streets bustling with life, and I felt the cool breeze against my skin. I needed the fresh air to dispel the shadows of unease lingering from the night before. The bright sunlight streaming through the buildings felt like a fresh start, a reminder that I was on the verge of something new. As I walked through the familiar streets of Philadelphia, memories flooded back, reminders of the struggle and sacrifice that had brought me to this moment. I recalled the countless hours spent training in the gym, the friendships forged, and the support I had received from Maria and Tony. I smiled at the thought of Maria's face lighting up whenever I shared my progress with her. After wandering for a while, I found myself outside the local cafe we often visited. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, inviting me in. I ordered my usual, a strong black coffee, and settled at a table by the window, gazing out at the city. As I sipped my coffee, I began to write down my thoughts in a small notebook I always carried. I felt compelled to document everything, the fights, the victories, the lessons learned. It was my way of processing the chaos around me. But even as I wrote, I couldn't shake the unease about that mysterious figure from the night of the fight. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke through my thoughts. "Hey, champ! Mind if I join you?" I looked up to see Tony approaching, a wide grin on his face. "Of course, man. What's up?" I replied, setting my notebook aside. "I just wanted to check in on you after last night," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "You seemed a little off during the celebration." "Yeah, I guess I'm just processing everything," I admitted. "It's hard to believe I've actually defended my title. But honestly, I can't stop thinking about that guy I saw in the crowd. Something about him felt wrong." Tony's expression shifted to concern. "What do you mean? What did he look like?" "I don't know, it's hard to explain. He had this intense look in his eyes, like he was waiting for something to happen. I just couldn't shake the feeling that he was there for a reason. I sighed, feeling the weight of my worries settle back in. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but it keeps nagging at me. Tony leaned back in his chair, considering my words. Maybe it was just a fluke. But if it's bothering you, we should do some digging. I mean, you just became a champion. People are going to notice. I nodded, appreciating his support. Yeah, I think I need to be more vigilant. I've worked too hard to let anything disrupt what I've built. Let's keep our eyes open then. If anything seems off, we'll deal with it together, Tony said, offering reassurance. With that, we spent the next hour discussing future fights, training regimens, and potential sponsorship deals. It was easy to get caught up in the excitement of what was to come, but the unease still lingered in the back of my mind. As we wrapped up, I decided to take Tony's advice and pay a visit to the local boxing gym later that day. I wanted to train, to focus on perfecting my skills and pushing myself further. I figured the best way to clear my head was to immerse myself in what I loved. Back at the gym, the familiar sounds of gloves hitting bags and the rhythmic thud of feet on the canvas filled the air. The energy was electric, and as I laced up my gloves, I felt a sense of purpose return. I was in my element, ready to unleash everything I had worked for. As I sparred with a training partner, I found my rhythm. Each punch, each movement felt powerful and precise. I pushed myself harder, fueled by the adrenaline and determination coursing through my veins. This was my sanctuary, this was where I belonged. But even in the midst of the training, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing just beneath the surface. The intensity of my sparring partner made me question if I was truly ready for the challenges ahead. I couldn't afford to let my guard down. After a grueling session, I took a break, my body slick with sweat. I stepped outside for a breather, leaning against the cool brick wall of the gym. As I caught my breath, I spotted a figure lingering at the entrance, the same man from the fight night. My heart raced, and a wave of anxiety washed over me. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make out his features. He wore a hooded sweatshirt, and as he caught my gaze, he turned abruptly and walked away. Instinct kicked in, and I followed him, the need to confront this unsettling presence urging me on. Hey! Wait! I called, my voice echoing in the empty street. He didn't stop, quickening his pace as he rounded the corner. I picked up my speed, adrenaline fueling my pursuit. As I rounded the corner, I found myself in an alley, the man just a few yards ahead. What do you want? I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. Why were you at the fight? He turned slowly, his hood obscuring his face. I'm not here to cause trouble, he replied, his voice low and calm. I stepped closer, my instincts on high alert. Then why were you watching me? Who are you? He hesitated, then pulled down his hood, revealing a familiar face. Vinny, it's me, Jake. My heart sank as I recognized him. Jake was a fighter I had once trained with, a promising talent who had fallen off the radar after an injury had sidelined him for good. Jake? What are you doing here? I thought you were out of the game. I am, he said, his tone serious. But I've been keeping an eye on you, Vinny. I wanted to see how you were doing. Why? I asked, suspicion creeping back in. After everything that happened, why would you care? Because I know what it's like to lose everything. I've seen too many guys like us get chewed up and spit out by this sport. I came to warn you, he said, his eyes narrowing with concern. There are people out there who will try to take advantage of you now that you're a champion. I was taken aback. What do you mean? Those debts Tony had, they're just the tip of the iceberg. There are others who see you as a target, and they won't hesitate to take what they can get. I've heard whispers, and I wanted you to be prepared. Why should I trust you? I challenged, but a part of me felt the weight of his words. He had always been a solid fighter, but the path he had taken was filled with mistakes. I know I don't have the best track record, but I'm not trying to manipulate you. I just don't want to see you make the same mistakes I did, Jake urged. Stay alert. Protect what you've earned. As I stood there, grappling with his warning, I could feel the tension in the air shifting. I needed to figure out how to protect myself and my future, my title, my life with Maria, everything I had worked for. "Thanks for the heads up, Jake," I said slowly, a mix of gratitude and apprehension in my voice. "I'll keep my guard up." He nodded, stepping back into the shadows. "Just remember, Vinny, the higher you climb, the more eyes will be on you. Stay sharp." As Jake disappeared from view, I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I had fought so hard to get where I was, and now, it seemed, I had to fight even harder to keep it. With renewed determination, I headed back to the gym. I would not let the shadows of my past dictate my future. I would train harder, stay vigilant, and confront whatever challenges lay ahead. As the days passed, I leaned on Tony and Maria for support. We discussed Jake's warning, strategizing about how to handle any potential threats. I was no longer just a fighter in the ring. I had to be a champion outside of it as well. The title defense would be just one of many battles to come. And as I prepared for what was next, I knew I would face those challenges with my head held high. I was ready to fight, ready to protect everything I had worked for, and most importantly, ready to embrace the future I was building. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of training and preparation. With Jake's warning still fresh in my mind, I approached each day with renewed vigilance. The gym became my fortress, a place where I could channel my energy and sharpen my skills. I surrounded myself with my team, Maria, Tony, and even a few trusted fighters, ensuring that we were all in sync as we prepared for the next fight. Maria continued to be my anchor, always encouraging me to stay focused. "You've got this, Vinny. Just keep your head clear and trust in your training," she would remind me, her faith in me unwavering. Her presence kept me grounded, and I fought not just for myself, but for us, for our future together. The night of my next title defense arrived, and the arena was electric with anticipation. The lights flashed, and the crowd roared as I made my entrance. This time, I felt an unshakable confidence wash over me. I was not just a champion. The night of my next title defense arrived, and the arena was electric with anticipation. The lights flashed, and the crowd roared as I made my entrance. This time, I felt an unshakable confidence wash over me. I was not just a champion. I was a fighter who had battled through doubt, danger, and the shadows of my past. With each step I took toward the ring, I could feel the weight of my journey, the sacrifices, the struggles, and the victories, fueling my determination. The fight began, and I focused intently on my opponent, who had come to challenge my title with ferocity. Each jab, each hook, was a reminder of the hard work and dedication I had put into my training. The rounds flew by, and I relied on my instincts and the strategies we had drilled. My corner cheered me on, and Maria's encouraging smile lit up the dim lighting of the arena. As the fight reached its climax, I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. With a final surge of energy, I unleashed a powerful combination, sending my opponent to the canvas. The referee counted to 10, and when he called for the match to end, the arena erupted in cheers. I had defended my title once again. In that moment of triumph, I raised my arms high, the championship belt glinting in the bright lights above me. I could see Maria in the front row, tears of joy in her eyes, and Tony cheering with a pride that radiated through the crowd. This wasn't just my victory, it was ours. As I celebrated in the ring, I made a vow to myself. I would use this platform to inspire others. I knew the journey of a fighter was not just about the battles inside the ring, but the challenges faced outside of it as well. I would be a champion who gave back to the community, helping young fighters find their way and encouraging them to pursue their dreams. In the weeks that followed, I began working on my new mission. I started a mentorship program for aspiring fighters at the gym, providing guidance and support to those who faced the same struggles I once did. I shared my story, the importance of resilience, and the necessity of surrounding oneself with a supportive team. With Maria and Tony by my side, we organized community events, fitness classes, and fundraising activities to help those in need. Jake's warning about the dangers of the sport became a catalyst for change within our team. We started a self-defense class to empower those who might feel vulnerable, reminding everyone that strength is not just physical but also mental. The community rallied behind us, and we became a beacon of hope for many. As time went on, my victories in the ring became intertwined with the impact I was making outside of it. I defended my title multiple times, each match solidifying my place in the sport while allowing me to use my platform for good. Each time I entered the ring, I carried the weight of my responsibilities, not just to win, but to uplift those around me. Years later, as I stood in front of a large crowd at a charity event, I reflected on how far I had come. The young fighters I had mentored were now stepping into the ring, full of potential and dreams of their own. I could see them thriving, confident and capable of facing their challenges, both in sport and in life. Maria stood by my side, pregnant with our first child. As I looked into her eyes, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. We had built a life together, filled with love, purpose, and hope. My title was more than just a belt. It symbolized everything I had achieved and everything I wanted to create for our family. "Vinny, I'm so proud of you," Maria said, her voice full of warmth. "You've turned your journey into something so beautiful. You're not just a champion, you're a leader." "Thank you, Maria. I couldn't have done it without you," I replied, feeling the emotion welling up inside me. "Together, we're building something incredible." As I addressed the crowd, I shared my story, my struggles, my victories, and my dreams for the future. I spoke about the importance of community, resilience, and the power of believing in one another. The applause that followed filled me with a sense of purpose, reaffirming my commitment to the path I had chosen. The journey of a fighter is never truly over, it evolves and transforms. I realized that my greatest fight was not just for my own success but for the future I wanted to create for others. And with each passing day, I was more determined than ever to continue that fight, not only for myself but for my family, my community, and for every young dreamer out there who needed a champion. As I stepped down from the stage, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. I was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, equipped with the strength of my past and the love of those around me. Together, we would continue to build a legacy of hope, courage, and perseverance, a true champion's legacy. Thank you for listening.